Hello, my name is Maaret Pyhäjärvi, and I wanted to spend this session in teaching you or sharing with you some of the experiences that I've been working with in the last year and a half in my latest place of work, Vaisala. The topic that we want to address here today is on exploratory testing, but not on exploratory testing from an individual, how do I test this kind of a perspective, but more from the exploratory testing as in we have a whole organization of people where exploratory testing needs to happen, and there needs to be some way of supporting and managing and helping people succeed in this style of testing and us succeeding as an organization. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. To get started with exploratory testing and conversations around that, I wanted to start with some of the first experiences to exploratory testing. I was in another conference a few weeks back, and we had a little panel discussion where basically there were three people having a conversation, and we started with our first experiences to exploratory testing that we ever had in our careers. The first one of us told her story, and she told the story of how their organization had specifications and tests and how they were working in a military domain, and how then a test manager of some sort, came one day and told the whole team of testers, everyone was invited, that they would have a half-a-day session on doing something called exploratory testing. This is kind of a typical way of getting introduced to exploratory testing. It's a session where you all of a sudden are made free of all of the rules that you usually in your regular work abide by. This is the way that we use exploratory testing as like an additional technique to a traditional way of doing testing. But the interesting part about the experience was that it was actually the session where they did all the relevant work of finding their bugs. And this is a very, very common experience. So why would we only want to limit the best work we do into this one Friday afternoon session where we find all the bugs? Because eventually that's what we're looking for, information about the problems in an effective way, which is what exploratory testing is about. Another one in our group talked about his first experience to exploratory testing, and he told about his first job ever. And what he was expected to do was, given a list of test cases in an Excel format, he would start, run those tests, test them to the best possible ability that he had, not really particularly giving any advice on how to break the rules and not just doing whatever the instructions said, but kind of like stretch and widen and reorganize and do something different so that you are not walking on the same footsteps on the minefield every single time. But when he got through that list, the advice was just start again. And when you do that again, start again and again and again. This is what I would call traditional manual testing. And for this guy, the revisiting the way they were doing testing in the organization came through a conference awakening where he met an exploratory testing advocate and heard that testing work doesn't have to be the way they were doing it in that particular organization. And all of a sudden, even with the list of test cases, the same guy could do better work in indeed the frame of testing than he could before. I was the third one, and I felt a little bit off. I was also really puzzled with the conversation in the sense that when I started with testing 25 years ago, my manager back then gave me some test cases. Sure, it was a organization that had hired us to do testing. They had given us some test cases. But she also, my manager back then, she gave me a budget of time, told me that I have all the time that I need in my hands, kind of talked about the frame in which my results are expected to be available, and introduced me to the idea that there will be a quality assurance on the results where the customer's organization's best testers, some of the senior testers, will do, sampling some of the testing we had done to see if we missed some of the bugs, and based on the results first give us feedback, but then there was also like a financial fine that we as a service provider would be losing money that we were sort of earning. So paying basically losing a bonus. That's more of what I would think of it, based on the results of the QA done after me. So all that mattered, even though I was given those test cases right from my very first job, was the results. So I have never seen the idea that exploratory testing wouldn't be my main way of working personally, other than through other people's experiences. And you might have come to your experiences about exploratory testing through any of these ways, and you can still be kind of growing it into any, also you can choose in the organization to grow it into any of these three positions on how you would look about the exploratory testing. The word exploratory testing itself, it came from Ken Kainer back in the good old days. I think it's already over 35 years ago when he coined the word exploratory testing to mean the smart way that people were doing testing that was clearly different from this test case-based view that we just talked about in those three, or the two of the three examples. And he noticed that there was this way of kind of keeping the test design and test execution very closely together, so that when you had them closely together, they would enable running new tests based on the learning coming out of running your previous tests. So focus on the learning, focus on the agency, the ability of the individual tester that was doing the work to do both the design and the execution instead of separating them time-wise or person-wise, and then make those choices in the moment of what would provide the best value right here, right now, in the moment. Over the years, as we've grown more into manual and automated and being able to kind of do also a lot of our testing using code as a tool that helps us, the manual and automated testing similarly have become things where instead of splitting them into two separate persons, the best testing, what I call now contemporary exploratory testing, is the kind where test design, both manual and automated perspectives to it, and test execution, both manual and automated perspectives to it, are kind of close together. And of course, we will be working closely also with the product design in the sense of understanding what is the thing we are designing our tests, running our tests against in any way. But we are, because of learning, we are optimizing for the impactful results. So bringing things together, not separating to different people, finding the way of holding the things that are needed for learning and agency, so that they are in the same person rather than separating them based on our skills and experiences. A new profile of skill building is definitely what's kind of behind this idea of exploratory testing and with the automation side, the contemporary exploratory testing in particular. So this is the world that I live in. So I come to a project with the idea that I'm given this kind of like a fuzzy, a little weird shaped thing, which is our application and our problem domain and whatever the users will end up using. And I am asked on behalf of the organization to somehow be available to hold space for the perspective of our users and find some of what all the other people have missed. Help the others miss less, of course, that's part of the assignment that I have. But how would I be able to do that as a modern tester in an organization if I couldn't be sharing stories of like, hey, did you know this? We haven't actually considered this. So information is at the core and forefront of all of this. The way I usually go about doing something like this is then working with various testers. So I wanted to also kind of on the side of how does exploratory testing work, recommend you a really great past talk. This is already from year 2013, so a few years ago already, a couple of jobs ago for me. Back then, Alexandra was my colleague as a consultant who was working in the same project and did a really nice lessons learned story on the project that we were working together on the particular feature that she was responsible for, and exploratory testing that, getting some feedback from me back then as a more senior tester who was enabling this agency that I'm still talking about in this talk. she got from a place where she found 5 things and thought she was done, with a little bit of feedback and awakening from me, to a place where she found 29 bugs, and a lot of those really, really relevant ones that she was kind of missing in the first place. So getting to a place where we get the support, are able to work with new products, work and figure out important information, and do great results on exploratory testing, supported by someone who is either a senior or a manager, is definitely a problem. So the usual way is kind of twofold, how to approach this. Managing testing in sessions is kind of the high-level idea of how you do the managerial work on this. So session-based test management, it's been around for quite many years. Some of the more recent materials and a really nice visualization come from Juka, who has been working in her own company around helping the whole organization in scale adopt session-based test management. And I took it here as a mention, basically because that's not what I do. Session-based test management is not the core of my story. The core of my story is what I now call contemporary exploratory testing, which means someone will show up for work, regardless of role, testers and developers, to do days of work in the teams, which are agile teams. There will be testing that is needed on the level of changes that we are right now making into a code. The pull requests will serve as inspiration. There will be testing made on level of stories, kind of the purpose of why are we making those changes. On epics, somehow kind of seeing the bigger picture of why all those changes, the stories are happening. But also on charters, like other perspectives on top of all of this that might help us talk about testing. And we'll do the work of testing within all of these different perspectives. The way I manage is focusing on input, usually making space for testing, making sure that people have time and possibility to concentrate, enabling new people, like the story with Alexandra in the previous slide. That's kind of a core part, giving feedback on early on what might you be not paying attention to, but also then focusing on the output, making sure that we have documentation that makes the future of testing easier in the same organization. And test automation, for me, it is just a form of test documentation. And I would much rather have automated test cases than have hundreds of so-called manually executable test cases documented in detail. So I have a strong bias towards let's spend time in automation, even when writing our notes down. But that's kind of the framing of this. Exploratory testing and managing exploratory testing has been around for quite some time, and I've been doing it for quite many years. But I don't often get these chances of going into a new organization and take a responsibility that is somehow different from the responsibilities that I have had before. And the story of this talk centers really around the experience that I have had for the last 1.5 years at Vaisala. So I joined a 1.5 years ago with the idea that they asked me to be responsible for end-to-end testing. There was someone who was trying to be responsible for end-to-end testing as a side job. And when I joined, they felt that there was an opportunity to move him into a different position and make me responsible for these systems, the new system that we were creating, end-to-end testing. And we very clearly had very different ways of approaching end-to-end testing in the first place. When I came, what I got as a starting point was some test automation cases, so sounds similar to what I might want to do on the level of just exploratory testing. But the test cases actually didn't run on my machine. They were very limited in scope. There was a lot more of that so-called automate the end-to-end testing work that was envisioned by the previous person to be done. And I realized, just kind of starting to learn the system, that this wouldn't actually take me very far if I would just follow the lead and tried myself kind of automating or testing by myself the end-to-end testing. The assignment that I got was one of a principal test engineer, which basically means that just like the rest of you, I have, 37 and a half hours, just like the previous guy had, only 37 and a half hours a week. But also, just like the previous guy had multiple positions and needed to be moved out of this end-to-end testing responsibility, it's not like I wouldn't be having other jobs as well. I was supposed to be the tester in a particular team. I was supposed to be a test facilitator for the entire project, entire product that we were building. And of course, as a newbie to the company, I didn't yet know in the beginning what the product would look like. But also as a third job that I was holding, I was supposed to be a test improver in the entire organization. Because, being a little bit more senior than others, there's more value in me if I can help others grow in scale much wider than just my own product. So I was actually holding 3 jobs. So I was definitely time challenged in the same way. The product that I was asked to test on is called Beacon. And it's basically a weather station with a cloud front end that allows you to see data coming from that weather station. And on the right-hand side there, you can see that the weather station actually, well, it's this one big pole with a lot of boxes and all kinds of nice bits and pieces. All of that coming together end to end has multiple stacks, multiple teams, hardware, firmware, operating systems to be integrated, multiple applications to be built for both internal and external use, web user interfaces, and some cloud software. So quite a large number of technologies for a single tester, no matter how principal or senior that person might be. So the way we then agreed that the project would go, of course I was facilitating my own role quite heavily there, is that for the first 6 months I would spend in one team out of the whole. And the next 6 months, or after that, it turned out that the practice has now been the next 9 months. I have been spending in another team rather than moving to a third team yet, because there's a lot of work to be done on the team B. But I got to kind of start testing with one team, figure out how to test for that team, how to talk with the other teams and other teams' product owners and guide the testing on their side, and only then move into another team and again do the work from a perspective of I am a hands-on tester now in this team, but it doesn't stop me from talking to all the other ones. But I also learned by doing this from these 2 teams that around the first team, there were multiple other teams internally that were available. Around the second team, I immediately, as I started even realizing that it exists, I started finding also other teams connected to it. And the more time over the year and a half I've been spending, the more little bits and pieces, black boxes or black balloons, meaning a team where there's multiple people working on something that gets integrated with the product, where I'm end-to-end responsible, and the white little squares there, meaning that there's an external third-party component that needs to be integrated, that no one other than testers generally feel immediately responsible for, if they can avoid it. All of this is kind of the end-to-end integration testing effort that I needed to coordinate. So you can imagine 37 and a half hours with this number of teams and interfaces, it's not really going to work too well. So currently, I've now spent a little over a year and a half in these 2 teams. I've found 14 internal teams that contribute to the end-to-end value of this system, and 7 external teams. It's a fairly large thing for me to manage from the end-to-end testing perspective. So I cannot do this testing by myself. So what did it then mean for me managing, because I'm still responsible for the end-to-end testing here. What did it mean and what did I learn on how to do it? So first of all, starting from what we already discussed on the idea that exploratory testing means that you don't separate test design and test execution. and that you focus on the results, and the results get better through learning that happens because people have agency. The first two major lessons that I drew on is focusing on the results. So basically looking around bugs, looking around what are we missing, what the other teams are finding, and test automation. What kind of results is that giving us? How's the coverage there progressing? That was one of the things. But the other thing, the second one, was protecting agency. We'll talk about this a little more. The idea of protecting people from this kind of like an external, I would give you test cases and you would follow my command. I would never try managing testing that way if I wanted to keep exploratory testing in place and get the right kind of results. The third lesson we will talk about a little bit here now then is on limiting scope or extending scope. So quite a regular thing that I needed to do with the teams is to figure out that someone was doing something that someone else was already doing, and we didn't need to overlap those two things. Mostly overlap is not a bad thing. It's actually good, and different teams will see different things in exploring them. Only it's a problem if there's a lot of bugs to be found. That will slow it down. Repeating same tests, if we have very little problems, it's actually a non... it's a cost we don't even have to care about. But limiting scope was sometimes necessary, but particularly needed to extend scope and make it so that the whole teams, not just the testers in the teams, would feel responsible for certain parts of quality, certain integrations, certain third-party acceptances that they wouldn't necessarily feel otherwise responsible for. So we'll talk about how we did that in the project. And the final lesson that we will also then talk about is this ideas that guided my test design and scale. So it's kind of like a summary of these results. So let's start on the theme of results. Like, what did it look like in practice? First of all, it matters that we talk about the information that we are providing as testers. I found myself in the role of someone facilitating end-to-end testing, telling a lot of stories for various stakeholder groups around the organization, both in one-on-one settings and in various meetings, various online Teams areas that we were using while working remotely, to make sure that we had ideas of the things we were missing, because there's some of the best inspiration for people to find something similar. I have a few shapes of coolest bugs. I don't really want to tell you all our dirty laundry and secrets, even if we have now fixed all of these bugs, but just to give you some of the shapes. One of the bugs was in an intersection of three teams, where if you look at one team alone, the feature was created that was working really well, great quality, exactly as we imagined, no problems there. The second team enabled access to that feature by including a button that you need to press physically that starts use of that feature. And then the third team coming into the picture added yet another physical feature encasing around the other physical structure, making the button inaccessible for our users. So we had a lovely functionality that the users can't access because it was hidden in an encasing. A typical problem on a system level for something that is embedded and self-built in the organization. So you really have to think in the terms of systems that are integrated to see some of these problems, or at least, imagine how everything is integrated when you're thinking in terms of these problems. Another type of problem, actually we had multiple ones like this, was ones where I started with the team 1 or team A first, and then I joined the team B later. And in between those two teams that I have worked in, there's quite many different teams and quite many different functionalities. So some of the really complicated system level bugs were such that I'm not quite sure what's the location where the bug could be best found, but you needed to see it from a customer's perspective to understand that it was a problem, and it then got fixed where the customer didn't see it. So in the system, going through all of those different steps to get the bug fixed somewhere else so that what the customer is seeing is correct. It was a kind of a typical case of bugs that we needed to share on. The third kind of bug was one where basically the bug is in the middle layer. It is in the third-party component that no one feels like they're owning. So the first team kind of feels it's not ours. The second team, that is an internal team, feels it's not ours. But those two teams will communicate through that third-party component, and the communication won't work. So again, finding the bug was one thing, getting it fixed, finding the owner between the two teams was another thing. And then the fourth kind of bug is one where the bug is actually a combination in all four different areas, and all four areas need to change in unison for the bug from the user's perspective to ever vanish. So with the shapes that I've given you, even though you don't know any of the details, you can maybe already kind of see that the challenge with end-to-end testing is not the challenge of automating, it's not the challenge of just testing, it's actually the challenge of getting the right teams to do the testing, but also own the results of that testing. And the principle that I was trying and did actually succeed in facilitating was this idea that if you would be driving the fix, you should be working with the other teams, driving the other teams in unison, in collaboration with your team to do the testing that is necessary to find that bug. I think we were actually pretty successful, and we built around these stories of the coolest bugs, we built a quite nice network of developers talking to developers, testers talking to testers, testers talking to developers across these teams that we had. And we knew how the network would work. And at least in particular, I and the product owners now know how the network could work so that we can facilitate that end-to-end kind of testing a lot better than we could without the exploratory testing and managing it in scale mindset. The other kind of result that I really needed to pay a lot of attention to in a system this size with this many people involved is that there will be a lot of change. And even though we really needed automation for regression purposes, because there would be continuous change, and the automation, we needed it kind of to be the spider web that would alert us to pay attention to the things that somehow were not the way we were expecting them to be, and every single team to hold on to their pieces of responsibility around creating some of this automation. We also learned that we need to talk and introduce automation that we might not run in the CI/CD pipeline at all, but we will run it, for example, for purposes of analyzing reliability by being able to repeat certain functionalities really many times, or to be able to analyze certain functionality over a larger suite or larger set of devices rather than only the one that we are testing on right now. So automation definitely for us wasn't only the regression perspective, it was also enabling us to do whole different kinds of testing that we otherwise were not doing at that time, and involved both developers and testers into this work that we were doing. The second level of things that I needed to do was on protecting agency. So I needed to figure out a way of making sure that whoever would be assigned as the person responsible for testing, they could both own the design and the execution of that particular thing. Automation would be left behind when others would join and could use that as a way of kind of getting some of the information. It would still work after the person would have left that active work on the feature. And I needed to make sure that there was also the agency around, both manual attended testing and the automation, by basically hiring people who could do both kinds of activities, including the 14-year-old who, during the 2 weeks that she spent with our project, got to actually learn both kinds of activities, and just the slice that she would be able to contribute in was a little smaller, but same principle: protecting the agency by making sure there's a mix of tasks, but the responsibility is of a size that a person can then figure out. To protect the agency, these were some of the practices that we ended up with. First of all, I introduced continuous releases. Continuous releases to 4 of the main teams in this end-to-end system. Some of the teams make now weekly releases, especially on the cloud side. They are now on that release cadence. And on the device side, I would like to say we are on a monthly cadence. We have been occasionally on a monthly cadence as well, but it was 2.5 months between the previous and the most recent release. So there's still a varying length in those releases. But when you have a shorter release length, it already helps protect the agency, as in the changes we are making are something that a single person can take a responsibility of without being dedicated for that particular thing for the rest of their career in the company. We did co-design workshops instead of status meetings. So a lot of times we would list ideas of how we would test together, rather than check that people are still testing and that testing is progressing. I resulted myself a lot into pair testing. So instead of asking, how are you testing? I would usually frame as the person trying to facilitate testing as in like, oh, you're going to be testing tomorrow. Can we do that together? And inviting people on the journey the same way with pair testing on whatever I took responsibilities of. Because I was also one of the testers in the team. And then we did regular review investments and looked at our results. We have just spent 3 weeks testing. We haven't found a single bug. Do we think we are doing the right thing? What could we learn based on the results on how we could somehow turn up the exploratory testing notch so that the results in automation that we can have for later, in bugs, in information, in coverage, different perspectives. How could we make that available? So these are the mechanisms that I used. The third practice that I thought was really, really, really relevant for us, I already kind of mentioned it a little bit in the sense of continuous releases, but limiting scope and extending scope through this kind of networked facilitation, it really boiled down to the frequent releases that we were making. So I had 4 teams with making now previously only one release at the end, or maybe one intermediate release somewhere in between for piloting purposes, which wasn't really a release, but it was kind of something that had to be management-wise forced out of the teams to know what the schedule might turn out to be. There was very little schedule control for the management side in that sense. So what we did was instead moving teams to these frequent releases so that we could at any point take the most recent one available and make a certain scope of the system available for the pilot customers. So I also facilitated the pilot customers and the versions that they had during the project quite heavily, and ensured that if they had feedback, the feedback would find the right teams in these fairly complex projects. The part on frequent releases that I was particularly proud of is the team that I'm still with right now. I've been there now for a little over 9 months. But a year ago, when I first started looking at this particular team, it took them 34 days to make a release. So from the moment of all changes are in, and developers are saying it works, we've already tested it, can't you just give it out to the customers? into having that little waterfall in the end where testers would then test it. We called it release testing, get some bug fixes in, and then finally label it as the actual release. The time frame was 34 days. With this continuous releases practice that I then introduced as a way of managing exploratory testing, we got to a place where now, from the moment when developer says it's been done, it's 2 days of lead time to release. It means we are nowadays testing while the developers are building, which is kind of a nice thing to do and needs to happen definitely. And out of that 2 days of lead time, there's 2 times a build that takes 4 hours to run and only 4 hours of testing, including running our automation set against the release and having a person, actually 2 people, because we are making 2 products on every single release, 2 people spending 4 hours a minimum on using the application, making sure that the different ways that the customer has their first out-of-the-box experience hasn't degraded. That's the practice that we now hold, how we do things. And all the other work, all the other exploratory testing, we push it to earlier stages, which we call then feature testing. And that we do in the context of the whole system, thinking about the different kinds of perspectives of these are the type of bugs that we are looking for, in addition to, of course, wanting to make our own components as good as possible. In this scoping work, I needed to also kind of figure out a way of talking about this end-to-end. So our end-to-end is kind of a long and long winding, and a lot of people very easily think that if they're given an end-to-end responsibility, it means that they would have to test from whatever A to E, which are the 2 ends, and make sure that we are seeing the things that A sends on the E. And rather, the way that I chose to understand this given assignment of be responsible for end-to-end testing meant that I had all these different component teams that I needed to work with and facilitate, so that the sum of all of the component teams actually covers the entire system, and would do that by spending some of my time doing attended testing rather than manual testing, between kind of like having my eyes on different ends and different interfaces that the users would see, spending regularly time and giving myself a chance of seeing how they were working, sharing that empirical experience there, but also facilitating to the continuously unattended perspectives between every single component and how they were integrated, so that the results of these would be available and visible not only within the team, but also for me, who was outside most of the teams. I was, well, first in team A and then team E later on. So figuring out a way of changing that is what I needed to do. And then finally, on the ideas that guide test design in scale. So kind of summarizing all of these different things that I do as manager of end-to-end testing, or a facilitator rather than a manager, because I am still also a tester in one of these teams. I think the ideas, almost like strategic level ideas, that I would take for myself for future projects, that I now offer for you to use in all of your projects, if you find any of them useful, I try to summarize them like this. First of all, the small continuous changes. I started off with a system where automation was not in a good shape. It's still not in a good shape. It is in a lot better shape than it was a year ago. But making small continuous changes where every single day, every single change that we're trying to do gets us to do better testing and doesn't leave automation behind, is how we've come to a place where we're now able to release within a few days multiple products. And I think we actually are getting to a place right now where we have a solid foundation, where very soon I would be saying we are working on a really nice and a great way of including this. But to lead that change while delivering the project, the main principle that I had to remember is that nothing will change for better if you don't change anything. So every single day, something small must be going to a better direction. And I might not know what better eventually will be, and I don't need to actually give people what it will eventually be. It is better if I can, as someone who facilitates testing, tell the next steps very clearly so that people can take the next steps in a very concrete way, and not just think about what good would look like, but take steps actively towards that good without understanding the good necessarily in the same scale and detail that you would if you have a few more years of experience of running these kind of things. So again, teaching people to look at the next step ahead of me. What do I see as are my options, and choosing between the options on my current horizon, and then continuously also growing the horizon. Really great practice on managing, and helped me tremendously in doing a good job in this project. Also, the other really core practice or idea that was really driving me came from my previous projects where I had worked on continuous delivery, that there is no better way of getting testing into a manageable shape than getting development into a manageable shape. And there's no better way of doing that for development than making the teams do releases on a regular cadence. So don't let the unknown build-up happen. Make sure you're closing the features all the way to the customer perspective frequently. That's the number one management idea that you need in managing exploratory testing at scale. Then, as a third item on the ideas that were driving me on this scale, is that you don't really need a lot of automation to start with automation based releases. It actually starts with just one test and the willingness to take a risk. And you can take a risk by having less customers that will have to face that risk, so you don't have to give it to all the customers. Find a way of giving it to just one at first. You can limit the risk by giving it first to internal or friendly customers. You can limit the risk by maybe adding some kind of extra thing yourself there if you feel like the risk is still like a really relevant one. But starting with just making those releases with that one test, or even having no tests whatsoever, continuous integration already changes the dynamic that makes testing, good quality exploratory testing with great results possible. My fourth item that was really driving me is that I was asking a lot of things through the product owners who have the power of making priority calls. So I would give the ideas of how to do a thing, what would the steps be next, directly to the testers to maintain their agency. But I would create the space for them to take the steps they needed to take by talking to the power and making sure they don't get in the way of good testing. Really important work. And my main personal takeaway is never ever, if I can avoid it, assign a task. Talk about the work with the person who is about to do it. Make them write themselves a task as a kind of I needed to understand it, review what they wrote down. But that is the moment where I enable the real agency with my actions, that I don't write them tasks, I don't write them instructions. I collaborate, they write their own instructions. Then another principle was staying visible. I would communicate a lot with summaries on various channels, ping different managers on great news. Did you notice how awesome things we were doing in testing and quality? Also paying attention to the great things happening for quality from the point of view of what the developers were contributing. Was really everyone's business to do testing in this project. But keeping that visibility it resulted in people getting bonuses for the great work. So I think that's a worthwhile thing also to do. Make sure that you also talk about the positive and keep that positive also visible, not only the negative. Use numbers as a start point of conversation. Usually they are great conversation starters in the sense that people tend to explain that they had certain results, but when they face numbers of what the results look like in the results that we can track, we can have a lot more grounded conversations on how we deal with the responsibilities. And again, blamelessness is important in these conversations. So you need to grow and not manage the people that are in the projects. So even though I very often think of it as test management, it's more like test facilitation, being a product owner for an end-to-end system from a quality perspective, working together with the other product owners and making space for great testing to happen by the developers, by the testers, by the product owners, by the third-party stakeholders, making sure that we get the feedback mechanisms in place and that they stay active and running well. I wanted to then conclude my talk today with the ideas that, even though I talk about managing in scale and enabling great testing, these are things you could ask from the management that you have or try to create these kind of structures and principles and practices in your organization. The real results don't come from people like me. They come from the people who are actually doing the testing. The finding and sharing of the new information, the being active and showing that you have that agency that someone is cultivating in you, it really matters. The fact that you're aware of where the time goes and you show you care, it matters. Thinking about, are you doing things for now or future, and having the conversations of, am I doing it for myself or for the others? Really important aspects on every single individual's level. Moving from reactive to kind of like, being on time and not just waiting for someone to ask for a thing, and learning to learn really, really well. These are all calls for action to every single one of us, whether we are managers or not. And finally, the takeaway that I want to leave you with. I talked about my experience over the 1.5 years. We did a lot of testing in a very collaborative way in a project that involved more than 100 people. And while I was working with a lot of different people, I couldn't work with every single one of them every single week. The work wasn't done by me, it wasn't done guided by me, it was done by the persons who were in the projects. And those persons were, some of them exploratory testers by trade, some of them test automation programmers, who are really capable also in doing exploratory testing, and some of them application programmers. And the collaboration between these different roles in figuring out how do we maintain that agency so that we don't end up in me doing something and then handing it to you, you doing something, and then handing it yet again to someone else. That's the core problem that we need to actually be solving in order to do this exploratory testing in scale. Testing is too important to be left for testers alone, but it's also too important not to have someone properly attending to, regardless of what their role ends up being in the projects. Thank you.